Heard this a lot from you guys in the comment section on the last video, and this is certainly true for myself, but there's also, I think, are some caveats to consider of some lessons that I'm actually kind of coming back to that I was doing in my 20s that I'm now starting to adopt and almost forget about in my 40s because of, I think, all the indoctrination of full range of motion and science-based training. And I was never really a big advocate on any sides of those factors. In fact, I don't really watch a lot of that content, despite being in the exercise science field as a professor. I definitely know just from intuition that a lot of people that I know that are actually heavily into science with their training just through observation typically didn't have the best physiques and or results. It was those people that were showing up consistently and really putting in the full work and ultimately kind of listening to their bodies. And that's really gonna be the focus of the video because I think there's really three things to consider if you're getting up there in age, whether you've been doing this for a long time or you are trying to get back in the game at a later age, just as a beginner or just starting back up again. Point number one, and maybe the most controversial, and it's one I wouldn't say across the board. None of these I think are across the board, they're just dogmatic statements to apply to all your training. But number one that has always been promoted, and it's one I'm a believer in to a certain extent, and I love doing things in this way, I'm talking about being careful and avoiding or using properly full range of motion. Now, of course, using and maximizing range of motion, it is not inherently a bad thing. And if anything, I would say you gotta put a context about all this stuff because full range of motion is really dependent on you and your needs and what you're gonna do with your life. So things such as full range of motion in your shoulders is of course good if you're gonna take up new activities and keep your shoulders healthy and mobile to keep yourself open to try different things. However, if you are doing some sort of laborious job or something that is very repetitive, like sitting in a desk or you're a farmer pulling weeds or like just pulling grain all day, your body's going to adapt to that type of posture and that type of behavior. And when it comes to in the weight room, lifting up and picking up heavy things, yes, getting full range of motion into a deep squat or using your shoulders in full range of motion is great, but you have to remember that not all bodies are built equally. And also, we got to admit this too, of course, the obvious caveat, our body is in a slow decline. So if anything, we have to learn to adapt to our training. So while yes, I can get into a full deep squat, or I was once trained by one of the best, I think, squatting coaches in the world about how to squat a certain way, I was doing it properly, but there were aches and pains and things kind of creeping up that I had to deviate from what they told me was quote unquote ideal. So I would say there's nothing wrong using partial range of motion, especially strategically when weight starts to get heavy. And that's one of the benefits, say, of, I was just doing this day in a workout, doing things like resistance bands. Getting into old age, resistance bands can be a great thing because they have that variable resistance in the sense that people notice they have less joint discomfort because they're actually doing the most amount of weight at your strongest position versus less amount of weight or less tension at the most vulnerable or weakest position. So if you take, for instance, the bench press, for years when I was growing up, I would do fairly heavy bench presses just for reps and 315 and beyond. But the way I would do it, and it wasn't really, I couldn't really see myself, so I didn't really know it, but some people would occasionally kind of drop by and say, hey, why are you doing those partial reps? And I wouldn't even say they're at partial, to honestly do some defense. I would kind of stop right about maybe an inch above my chest. I would still break around 90 degrees in my elbows, and that's kind of how I would judge it, how I could kind of intuitively with kinesthetic sense feel that I was there. But I would do that for years with absolutely no joint pain or discomfort. Flash forward many years, I started to experiment with slower tempos. I started going into full, deeper ranges of motion. And that's when I started to feel like that when I went back to bench press, I started to forget the way I used to do it, which was in not going into full depth and really kind of putting more stress or unnecessary stress on the shoulders where I was getting more of it in the chest. All that to say that my recommendation for a lot of people when I'm working with them is don't feel like they have to force themselves in a range of motion, otherwise it's uncomfortable, especially when you start adding on external loads and weights. Doesn't mean you can ignore that range of motion, but it also means you don't have to sacrifice weight or in this case, ditching the bench press altogether. Find a certain range of motion that kind of works for you. Another good example are things such as the rule of thirds. So this is known in physical therapy, just rehabilitation settings, that if you have pain, say right about here at 90 degrees, many people will do a lot of weight and a lot of tension right here in the range of motion that they can, and you actually can add on and pack on more strength in a given range of motion. So even though you're not doing a full range of motion, you are still building strength and integrity in that desired muscle that you're intending to work. But it doesn't mean that I would say only do partial range of motion. There are a lot of exercises, squat in particular, that I am getting into a deep full range of motion or bicep curls, but there are some things specifically with shoulders that throughout the years I've had to adapt. And that leads me to the second point, which is finding different positions for specific staple exercises. As we get older, we like to think we can just keep this range of motion that we're working or the strength that we're working, and then it's just not going to be the case. You got to find some subtle adaptations. So again, good example, just going back to the shoulders, a strict overhead military press is great, but I found for a lot of people over the years, if they also want to keep that heavy weight over their head, they either can just drop the load or drop the weight. That would be a great recommendation. Otherwise, going more in a neutral position like this versus being externally rotated. You are still gonna get the big benefits you want out of the deltoids, and I would say sometimes even more so out of that. And if you are lacking a certain area, you can always compensate for that with another exercise. The other big one is that people are doing a lot more nowadays, which is just purely doing lateral raises and not even doing an overhead press. I personally still like doing an overhead press, and there's definitely an argument for just doing things like incline or doing your chest with your lateral raises, and that kind of covers all your bases. I think that makes sense. But I still do like from time to time doing things like an overhead press. In fact, I was just doing it here. This looks kind of light and not a whole lot of weight. And that's gonna lead to my third point, which is not only maximizing different positions and things that work for you, and ironically, sometimes being locked in is a good thing. So this lever arm actually cannot move and I can manipulate it, but I found it feels better for my shoulder if I keep it fixed and locked in for this particular exercise. But notice the weight is not that heavy. Of course, these arms are kind of heavy, but I'm working within a range of motion and also a strength curve in position that allows me to kind of get into where I want to be. But this would be my third and final point, and that is maximize new tools at your disposal. I meet a lot of guys who for one reason or another can be kind of sticklers to one thing, and that is not necessarily a bad thing, but you're of course going to be limited to the tools at your disposal. If you're just going to be a barbell squat rack type of guy and just weights, that's it, you're not going to touch anything else. I mean, that's fine, but I always tell people, hey, if you can add some dumbbells, that's going to open up some doors. You can add some bands. I know things like this can be kind of expensive, but now there's actually cheaper options out there. You can make your own landmine. There's little platforms such as this that kind of help support your back. A lot of equipment out there that, of course, this costs some money, and that's going to be an expense for people, but everyone has access to a gym if that is going to be the case. My point is try and be flexible with the tools and adapt with the times, because nowadays there's a lot more tools, and there's some old school tools that you can adapt as well that can help you get around those certain deviations. So to sum all this stuff up, guys, my point is you got to be adaptable in your game. You got to not feel like you have to be rigid and just sticking to one ideal quote unquote range of motion. Find the range of motion that works for you. 2, find that positioning that really works for you. And 2, to follow up with that, not just going with range of motion, but also finding that positioning. Don't feel like you have to stick to one ideal movement pattern, say for a vertical push, when there's so many things out there at your disposal. And 3, maximize all the great innovative tools that are coming on the market, or old school tools that maybe you didn't think were that cool, such as bands or lever arms, or even sophisticated things like this belt squat that just seems kind of intimidating that people don't even want to touch. You got to be creative to stay in this game for the long haul. If you guys want more information and tips on how to do that, definitely feel free to contact me. That's one of the specialties that I try and do. Make things interesting, make sure you can adhere to the exercise, and most importantly, you can do so pain-free into ripe old age. Thank you guys for watching.